Good evening. I hope everyone's doing well this evening. I'm very excited. Now there's the audio. I'm very excited about the program that we're going to be having, the Serpentine Prophecy. So welcome everybody to the Serpentine Prophecy. And we're going to have Sean Boonstra talking to us about some things that I think are going to be very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to learning as much as I can. Afterwards, we're going to have a little study guide, and we're going to go through that together, and we'll be done. I expect it to take about an hour total. So we're going to watch the video now.
Hey, welcome to Colorado. I'm Sean Boonstra, and I'm going to take you on a little drive up the mountains that way, about 90 minutes, to the Stanley Hotel, reported to be one of the most haunted buildings in all of America. We're going to spend the night in room 217. That's where Stephen King was inspired to write The Shining. They say Jim Carrey couldn't spend the whole night in there, so we're going to give it a try and see what happens. F.O. Stanley had tuberculosis, which back in the 19th century could easily turn into a death sentence. So his doctor told him, move out to Colorado. The air's a lot drier. You have a better chance of beating the disease out there. So he got here in 1903, and he brought along the car that he invented, the Stanley Steamer, so that he could drive around. When summer came, he thought Denver was just a little too hot for his liking. So he drove up one of these canyons here to Estes Park, some 7,500 feet above sea level, to get out of the heat. Of course, in those days, there was no pavement. You could barely call this a road. And his car was steam-powered, so he had to stop and fill it with water periodically. After about 2 hours, he made it to the town of Estes Park, and he loved it so much that he and his wife, Flora, decided they were staying. They built a gorgeous house that is still standing to this day, and then they built one of the most popular attractions in America, the famous Stanley Hotel. Nearly 300 luxurious rooms that started to draw the who's who from all over the country and around the world. Teddy Roosevelt stayed there, and so did the J.C. Penney family, Harvey Firestone, and Dr. Mayo, and Billy Graham, Enrico Caruso, Wayne Newton, Bob Dylan, the Emperor of Japan, John Philip Sousa used to perform there in the summers, and, well, you name it. It's still a pretty popular place. In fact, I had to make arrangements a long ways in advance to be able to stay there. And it's a really great example of an I made it in America story, except this one's got a dark twist to it. After Flora Stanley died in 1939, people claim they could still see her ghost wandering the hallways at night. And the same with F.O. Stanley after he died in 1940. Then we have the legend of Lord Dunraven, an immensely unpopular developer who used to stay in the hotel, and people say his ghost is up on the 4th floor haunting the hotel, opening closets while people are sleeping, making noises, all the usual ghost stuff. From what I understand, members of the psychic community have come to see the hotel, and a lot of them refuse to stay overnight because of all the paranormal activity. And if you count up all the ghosts the psychics say live there, they've counted something like 12 separate entities. There's actually this little service tunnel underneath the hotel for staff members, and they'll tell you that sometimes when they're down there, they'll hear their name being whispered from the shadows. They do these Halloween ghost tours for tourists in the hotel as well, and people who go on the tours say suddenly the air will get cold in the hallways, or they'll hear footsteps around them, or even feel invisible hands pushing on their legs. Every so often, I'll see these stories in my news feed where someone took a picture in the lobby or on a staircase. And later, when they look at the picture, there's a ghost that wasn't there when they took it. The most recent case showed a woman in 19th century clothing turning the corner at the top of the stairs. Pretty spooky stuff. There are lots of haunted rooms in the hotel, and as you can imagine, they're all very popular for tourists hoping to spot some kind of specter. But there's one room on the second floor that is the most haunted of all, room 217. And that's where I'm going to be spending the night. They say it's haunted by the ghost of Elizabeth Wilson, a maid who used to work at the hotel. Back in 1911, the hotel had a power outage, so she went into the room to light up the backup gas lamps. But for some reason, the gas was already on. And so when she entered the room with her lit candle, she blew the room apart, and she fell through to the McGregor room down on the first floor. Now, even though it destroyed that end of the building, somehow Elizabeth managed to survive, and she kept on working there until the day she died in 1951 at the age of 90. They say she died peacefully in her sleep. But according to some people, that doesn't mean that she's actually resting in peace, because some guests report that when they get into the hotel and put their suitcases in the room and then they go for dinner, they come back and all their clothes are neatly put away in the dresser drawers. Or if they're messy or you're a rude guest, you'll come back to your room and find your stuff thrown all over the floor, maybe to let you know just how rude and messy she thinks you are. Some people say, man, the bathroom lights go on and off, the faucet turns itself on and off, and the bathroom door begins to open and close without anybody touching it. It's hardly the stuff of a dream vacation. But the event that really put room 217 on the map happened back in 1974 or 75, when Stephen King and his wife stayed there for the night. He was a school teacher in Boulder, I believe, and he was suffering from writer's block, so he came up into the mountains to get away, do a little thinking, and they checked into the Stanley Hotel. And they were the only guests because it was the very end of the season, the last day. Mrs. King went to bed. Stephen King began to wander the hallways and eventually ended up down at the bar, struck up a conversation with the bartender for a little while, and then went back to bed. And that's when he had this horrific nightmare about the fire extinguisher right outside the bedroom door. It had this massive fire hose, and in the dream it turns into a huge serpent, and it chases his son down the hallway and wraps itself around the boy like a python. That was the inspiration for one of the creepiest novels ever written, The Shining, which came out in 1977, the movie in 1980. It was the story of a family spending the winter in an empty, haunted hotel. And it's about a man descending into madness. It's full of very disturbing scenes, some of which still circulate as memes on the internet because they're just so, well, alarming. I understand that at the front desk, all the room keys hang in a certain direction except for the key to room 217, which they hang backwards, I guess to make things look just a little spookier. Today, the room's so popular that it's usually booked a year or more in advance, and they have to sell 217 door plates down in the gift shop because too many people were stealing the real plate from the door, I guess, as a souvenir. Well, here we are, the Stanley Hotel. Tonight we're going to find out what really happens in room 217. Before we go inside, I need to show you something. a surprising tie to the ancient past, something that links that room directly to the oldest civilizations on the planet. Most of us grew up with a story about who we are and where we come from, a story that sounds entirely plausible when you first hear it. They say we're the product of lower life forms that slowly adapted over very long periods of time until we finally stepped out on the world stage as Homo sapiens, a term that means the ape that thinks. And I'll admit, the way I'm going to state this theory is a bit of a caricature, but it suggests that before we started to think, and before we started to contemplate the meaning of our existence, we were foraging for food and swinging from trees like most other primates. And then we discovered fire and found refuge in caves and forged simple tools. And all of this, we're told, was the product of time plus chance, with the raw materials of the universe just somehow converging to produce us, the self-aware human. But some of the stuff we've been finding in the ground kind of leaves this nagging doubt about just how accurate that story really is. Instead of a slow, smooth progression upward where you and I stand at the apex of evolution, we find remarkable evidence that maybe, just maybe, ancient civilizations were not as backward or unsophisticated as we thought. Take, for example, the rather unsettling discovery made at Göbekli Tepe. Just when we thought we'd seen the earliest evidence of more advanced human civilizations, either in Mesopotamia or Egypt, suddenly we found what appears to be the world's oldest temple under a hillside in southeast Turkey. What we found kind of resembles the circles at Stonehenge, except they're much more complicated and obviously older. And these aren't just plain stones. They're covered with elaborate carvings of people and animals. And they suggest an ancient form of worship that was already happening long before we thought people were living in caves. There are 50 of these structures buried at the site, and the confusing thing about it is the way that a rather advanced civilization just kind of pops up on the timeline of history, with no real evidence that the people who built it slowly evolved to the point where they had these kinds of skills. Somehow, it seems like they mastered the arts of architecture and agriculture simultaneously, with no evidence of learning these things over long stretches of time. We don't find less advanced buildings suggesting that their ability evolved. It just kind of starts big. The same is true for ancient Egypt, whose treasures and cultural achievements still captivate our imagination to this day. It's another place where we don't really find a lot of evidence of more ancient people who slowly evolved to the point of becoming the world's dominant civilization. The Egyptians just appear in pages of history fully formed and already quite advanced. They had massive temples, stunning art, philosophy, astronomy, math, written language, seemingly right from the start. And that kind of flies in the face of the stories you and I were told back in high school. Let me see if I can illustrate what I mean. Just think about your smartphone, the one you probably have in your pocket right now. If you've been alive for a few decades or more, you'll remember all the steps that it took in your lifetime to get us to this kind of technology. When I was a kid, some families I knew, not a lot, but some still had that old wooden crank phone on the kitchen wall, the one that was connected to a party line. By the time I started using the phone, we had a rotary dial machine that we rented from the phone company with a big coiled cord that basically kept you tethered to one room. Then came the touch-tone phone, and then call waiting, and then we cut the cord and we moved to cordless phones, and then we got cell phones. There was a clear progression, and it's easy to see. I also learned to use an abacus when I was a kid, one of the oldest computing devices on the planet. Maybe some of you would remember it. You moved beads along a rod to keep track of ones, and tens, and hundreds, and then some of you learned to use a slide rule when you studied physics. And then we got pocket calculators, and then scientific calculators, and personal computers, and eventually the computer merged with the phone and gave you this. The evolution of the smartphone is easy to uncover, but with some of these ancient civilizations, it's not quite so easy. Some of them just seem to start at a really advanced stage. Of course, that could mean that we haven't yet found all the stuff that leads up to a more sophisticated society, and I'm no archaeologist, so I could be wrong about this. Maybe there is evidence that Egyptian civilization emerged very slowly. But if there is, there's not a lot of it. And one thing I am certain about, these people certainly weren't any less intelligent or less sophisticated than we are. In fact, in some ways, I wonder if they weren't a little smarter. Almost all of us owe a huge debt of gratitude to the ancient Egyptians, including the much-fabled Greek philosophers who get so much credit for building Western civilization. It turns out that Pythagoras, the guy who taught you how to measure the sides of right triangles, he went to school in Memphis in Egypt and likely gleaned a lot of his number theory while he was there. In his book, Politics, Aristotle mentions,
"The Egyptians appeared to be of all people the most ancient, and they have laws and a regular constitution existing from time immemorial. We should therefore make the best use of what has been already discovered and try to supply defects."
So we know he was borrowing from the Egyptians. And Plato, after the famous death of Socrates, traveled to Egypt to learn from a priest of Horus. And he says something rather remarkable in his book, Phaedrus. Listen to this.
At the Egyptian city of Naucratis, there was a famous old god whose name was Thuth.
You and I might say Thoth.
The bird, which is called the ibis, is sacred to him, and he was the inventor of many arts, such as arithmetic and calculation and geometry and astronomy and drafts and dice. But his great discovery was the use of letters.
Now that is something I really want you to pay attention to. This is a very important thread that ties the ancient Egyptians directly to the writings of Plato, which of course become one of the most important foundations for Western civilization. It's this mysterious figure, Thoth. According to ancient legend, Thoth was a wise Egyptian sage, a philosopher, who was so gifted that he eventually achieved divinity. That's why Plato referred to him as a god. They say he invented Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he introduced the Egyptian people to the sciences of architecture, astronomy, math, medicine, geometry, and just about every academic discipline. And then he gave the people the gift of religion. You can find his likeness just about everywhere in the ruins of ancient Egypt. He's often got the head of an ibis, sometimes with a sun disk on top, and often with a serpent somewhere close by. He was the messenger god. And when the Greeks learned about his accomplishments, they identified him with their own messenger god, Hermes, and they gave him the name Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great. His teachings were revered, and people began to collect them, quietly passing them down from one generation to the next, giving them to carefully selected initiates, people in the know, who would keep them away from the wrong people and protect them from corruption. We believe a lot of his material was collected and collated at the famous library of Alexandria, which means it was still in existence thousands of years after Thoth began to teach it. And a lot of those same ideas, well, they're still in circulation today, 5,000 years later. And I think you might be surprised to discover just how many well-known people have taken the time to study them, from Leonardo da Vinci, Roger Bacon, and William Blake, to Copernicus and Isaac Newton. You can still find books today like this one, books that claim to be this same collection of ancient Egyptian wisdom, and they usually carry the title Hermetica, or the teachings of Hermes. Now, the likelihood that this is exactly the same thing that the ancient Egyptians and Greeks were reading, I don't really know, because it's been thousands of years and legends have a way of growing over time. And there have been so many people who have studied this stuff that I have to think there have been some additions and subtractions along the way, and maybe even some forgeries. But we do have enough material to kind of piece together what all these people believed. The ideas in this book, they're very, very old, and they're very, very influential. This stuff was read by some of the earliest Muslim scholars and any number of Western novelists ranging from Mary Shelley to Daniel Defoe, and even Shakespeare appears to have drawn from its pages, as well as other derivative works. This is one of the most influential books in the history of Western civilization, even though most people have never heard of this. And I suppose I could sit down and read this to you, but maybe it'd be easier if I just summarize what I consider to be some of the most important ideas that have come from the disciples of Hermes Trismegistus over the last 5,000 years. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is going to sound a little strange, but I'll bet it still seems familiar because parts of it have quietly permeated almost every corner of our thinking. This might be one of the most important narratives you're ever going to hear because it still shapes the way that most people think about some of the biggest questions in the world, like what happens when we die, or where in the world did humanity come from? And it certainly sheds a lot of light on what's been going on at the Stanley Hotel. You see, the ancients believed, as most people still do today, that there was a mind in this universe before anything material was actually created. The whole universe was just God's thoughts at one point, and that's all there was. But to the ancient pagan way of thinking, those thoughts were like waves of energy radiating out from the mind of God, so powerful, so full of life that they were, well, essentially living beings in and of themselves. These thoughts, they spread like waves across the cosmos, and they became a fine mist of proto-matter in the pagan version. So fine that it wasn't really made of particles or matter the way that we would think about it. It was more like a cloud of gas. And over time, those thoughts became more real, first transforming into liquids and then solids. And maybe I should correct myself. To the ancient philosophers, it would be a mistake to say that these cosmic thoughts became more real as they became more solid, because, as Plato said, ideas are the things that really are. In other words, Plato taught that ideas are more real than the physical world we perceive with our senses. It's a strange way of thinking for you and me because we were raised with a scientific mindset, which teaches the physical world is more real than your thoughts. But to the ancients, it was the other way around. The ultimate reality was the mind of God, the thoughts of God that radiate throughout the universe. It's a way of thinking that belongs to what we might call the esoteric mystery schools, ancient pagan schools that use this strange perspective to explain the existence of the universe. The thoughts of God became a fine mist, which contains all the materials needed for the creation of life. It eventually becomes Mother Earth, the cradle of all life as we know it today. But then, in the legends, a dark god swoops down on Mother Earth and causes a violent storm. He is death, because after all, if you can live, if you can exist, that also means you can stop living. The Egyptians would have called him Ptah, a god who molds the earth on a pottery wheel, making it more physical, more restricted than a mere cosmic mist. He's really doing the work of condensing, congealing the world so that it becomes highly restricted by a physical existence. The Greeks called him Saturn, the great limiter, the one who tried to put up a barrier to the creative work of Mother Earth. And of course, back in that day, the ancients thought that Saturn was the last planet in our solar system, so it kind of created an orbital limit around the whole family of planets. Some people portrayed Saturn as a serpent that encircled the entire solar system, and they even sometimes depicted him as a dark god with a scythe, the same way people depict the Grim Reaper to this day. The Greeks even said Saturn ate his own children. In ancient pagan mythology, the sun god, either Ra to the Egyptians or Apollo to the Greeks, the sun god pushes back on death and warms the earth, causing the particles of the universe to vibrate and begin what some people call the dance of the substances. And that created the first bits of vegetable life, which wove together in a huge floating web of plant life that filled the whole universe and kind of looked like a massive flowering tree. That vast cosmic tree, they say, was really the first man, what some people might refer to as Adam. And he lived in a cosmic paradise where all his needs were met without effort. They say he had no desires because they were met before he could need them. And that's when another dark force, another massive serpent suddenly appears and wraps itself around this cosmic tree, squeezing it and forcing it to become more solid and more independent and self-contained. And that was the birth of animal life. Up to that point, there was still just the cosmic mind. Every living thing was bound together by a cosmic consciousness, kind of like the Borg on Star Trek, but nicer. Everything connected, everything is one. But as the serpent did his terrible work, we suddenly got physical animal life and then eventually human life as we know it today. And the one big tragedy that happened, they said, was the way we all became individuals. We were no longer connected, no longer part of the great cosmic mind. It was every man for himself. We were real and physical and separated. So the gods of enlightenment had to come and teach us to self-reflect, to consider philosophy, and find a way back to our original spiritual existence. So here's the big idea that I want you to consider before we go back to the Stanley Hotel. The ancient pagans taught that mind existed before matter, and I'd have to agree with them on that point. It's hard to understand how thinking, rational, self-aware, contemplative beings like you and me managed to develop from a cloud of inanimate particles, unless something or somebody was out there thinking before the universe was created. Matter before mind just doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to work that way. But the way the ancient philosophers told this story, the solid physical universe was a big mistake, a downgrade from the bliss that we had when everything was a non-material cloud, a big cosmic mind. In some of our upcoming episodes, you're going to see why that concept still matters today. They said that a perfect existence is only found in a non-material state as we return to the cosmic mind that first gave birth to life. And that is radically at odds with the way this book, the Judeo-Christian record, explains the origin of the human race. Listen to this. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. That account doesn't suggest that our physical existence, flesh and blood, is some kind of mistake or the product of malevolent forces. It says this is the way we were made, solid, real, material, and the divine creator declared it very good. We were not a downgrade from a cosmic vegetable man or a big cosmic mist. We were not created through the antagonism of a cosmic serpent who forced this physical existence on us. But these stories, told by the disciples and successors of Hermes Trismegistus, well, they're still kicking around, lurking in the shadows, and the influence they have on the way we think, it's bigger than you might suspect. And eventually, we'll go see if we can find it somewhere behind door 217.
Hey, thanks for joining us for episode 1 of the Serpentine Prophecy. Sean just mentioned that we aren't here by chance. In fact, according to the Bible, we were created by God in His image. Let's look into that a bit more, so don't go away. We've got some pretty useful stuff for you coming up. Go ahead and take out lesson guide number 1. The people you're with are going to review the guide with you, looking deeper into the secret of room 217. We want you to be a part of this, so stick around.
Interesting, huh? So, everyone take out your study guide Everyone should have a study guide. And before we start, I want to just let you guys know, if there's somebody that you guys know who might be interested in this series is going to be played in its entirety in ICTV. So it will be played on ICTV, and it will be played 1 week later. So next Thursday night at this exact time, it will be on ICTV. And then our program tomorrow night at 7 will be 1 week from tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. So if there's anybody that you think, hey, they might really benefit from watching this as well, so you guys can let them know about ICTV as well for next week. So let's take a look at question number 1. Sometimes the findings of archaeologists reveal that our ancient ancestors weren't as primitive as we supposed. Why do you think many people automatically assume that we are more advanced than our ancestors simply because they lived in a previous era? Can you think of ways in which perhaps our ancestors were more correct than we are today? So I want this to be a little bit interactive. So can you guys think of anything? We assume that we are more advanced now than our ancestors were. Is it possible that our ancestors in some areas were more advanced than we were? I want to hear what you guys have to say. Not all at once, please. All right, so if you didn't hear that, the Mayan calendar, the way they just knew about the time and how things were kept back then. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. The Mayan calendar shows that our ancestors knew a lot about time. What else? Yes? Yes, okay, so the way that the Mayan temples were built, another comment is said, how they faced certain astronomical bodies. And I have had the privilege of going to see a Mayan pyramid in South Mexico. And it's really, really neat that once a year the shadows go in a certain way, and yeah, so very, very good. You had another point. There was a hand raised over there.
Yeah. So the Egyptian pyramids are still a mystery. Without the modern technology we have today, we don't know how we'd be able to replicate that.
Yes, so the Egyptian pyramids, we are told, still a mystery. Thank you, Derek, for mentioning that. It's still a mystery. Even with our modern technologies that we have no clue how the Egyptians were able to put those things together. Yes, Ricardo, you have something?
Yeah, another one probably Stonehenge.
Stonehenge. How did they put that together? How did they build that? Those are all very, very good points. One thing that sometimes we confuse is that technology, high technology that we have, that is not equal to wisdom. So if maybe we remember our grandmother talking about how her grandmother, when somebody was sick, they knew what herbs to take and what to do to make them feel better. And, you know, when we're sick, what do? Just go to the hospital, go to the doctor, go to the emergency room. And our ancestors, just a few generations back, just 3, 4, 5 generations back, they knew how to cure certain diseases. Now, we do have technological advances. They didn't know how to do what we do with heart transplants and heart surgeries and those types of things. But there was a lot of things that they knew that have been forgotten. A few years ago, I was water skiing. Well, I should rephrase that. I tried to water ski. And as soon as I started to water ski, I felt a pop on my legs right here, and I knew something was wrong. When I came back on the boat, I couldn't stand up. I tried to stand up, and I immediately fell. I was taken in a wheelchair, and this was at a summer camp, so there was no doctor there or no hospital there immediately. And there was a camp doctor. And this camp doctor brought me in. He goes, there's something that I learned from that was used a long time ago. And he said, this is hydrotherapy. I'm gonna do some hot and cold water treatments on your legs. And he did some cold and hot water treatments on my legs. Did that for about an hour. And I left in a wheelchair. I went back to my cabin. The next day, I was walking fine. That had never happened. I had had an injury like that before playing soccer, and that had lasted several weeks before I could actually walk without a limp. But the next day, I was walking fine. I didn't try to water ski, but the things that he did, that pretty much amazed me. I've never seen a doctor do something like that before. Anyone else? Well, I think we can agree that just because our ancestors didn't have the technological advances that we have now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have wisdom and they didn't know a lot of things that maybe we don't know today. Let's take a look at question number 2. Egypt was a highly advanced civilization, and in some ways it became a cradle for the Israelite nation. Slavery in Egypt was at least a formative influence on the mindset of the Israelites. What does Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 29 reveal about the nature of this ancient empire as compared to the worldview of the children of Israel? So let's take a look at that verse. Hebrews 11, 24 through 29. I'm going to put it on the screen for you guys to follow. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. So, what do you guys think? What does that verse that we just looked at, what does that reveal about the nature of ancient Egypt, the ancient Egypt empire, as compared to the worldview of the children of Israel? So when we compare ancient Egypt with the worldview of the children of Israel, what Moses was thinking, how do we compare them? How did Moses compare those two worldviews or those two ways of thinking? Yes?
I would say one looks temporary and one looks eternal.
All right, so I'm for those of you who are here, I'm repeating the answers because there are people who are watching us online who don't hear what is being said. So one is temporal and one is eternal. Very, very good. So that's a good way of comparing that. Here, the verses that we read tells us about the way Moses saw those two ways of thinking. The Egyptians, he saw it as temporal. The Israelite way, God's way that he'd given to the Israelites, he saw that as eternal. Now the Egyptians, they had a lot of stuff, didn't they? They had history, they had sciences, they had education, wealth, and those were all at the fingertips of Moses. And yet Moses said, I think this other way of doing things, of thinking, I think that is more important. So right there in Hebrews it tells us Moses left those things and went with the people of Israel. He rejected the Egyptian culture and accepted the Israelite culture. Does that make sense? Does anybody want to say anything else about this? All right, let's take a look at the next question. Question number 3. The writings of Hermes Trismegistus, and that's the person that Sean was talking about, and other ancient pagan luminaries insist that God's thoughts permeated the universe as a kind of mist before anything material was created. In some regards, there is some slight agreement with the perspective of the Bible regarding God's place in the universe. What do the following texts reveal about the nature of God and creation? So we're going to look at some text and see what do they reveal about the nature of God and creation. Let's take a look at the first one. Psalm 90 verse 2. Psalm 90 verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So what does this say? What is the nature of God and creation according to this text? What do you guys see? They're the same. They're the same in age, that they've lasted a long time. In other words, God permeates the creation, right? He's always been there from everlasting to everlasting, right? So God formed the mountains, formed the earth, and as old as the mountains are, God has been before, right? Does that make sense? Any other comments on this? Let's go to the next verse. Proverbs 8:22 through 30. Proverbs 8:22 through 30. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His way, before His works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While as yet He had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world, when He prepared the heavens, I was there. When He drew a circle on the face of the deep, when He established the clouds above, when He strengthened the fountains of the deep, when He assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters could not transgress His command, when He marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside Him as a master craftsman, and I was daily His delight, rejoicing always before Him. So in this verse is talking about wisdom, but it's the personification of wisdom. So Christians from the early centuries have understood this to mean that wisdom is personified in Christ. So this is talking about wisdom, God's wisdom, and Christ as the personification of God's wisdom. And notice what it says. How long has Christ and God's wisdom been around? I didn't hear you. Forever. Right? Before all these things happened, He was there. Before the universe was created, God's wisdom was there, personified as Christ. Does that make sense? Any questions? Let's go on to the next verse. Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And verse 16, for by Him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through Him and for Him. So who's it talking about? How were things created? Who is Him? God? But can we be a little bit more specific? Who's the firstborn over all creation? Jesus, right? So through Jesus, everything was created. He brought everything into existence. And let's take a look at Micah. Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler of Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. So we know this as a prophecy of where Jesus was going to be born. Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem, and we know that. He was born in Bethlehem. But notice what it says about Jesus. Whose going forth are from of old, from everlasting. So, how old is Jesus? What does it say here? From everlasting, right? Before he was born in Bethlehem, he existed. He was around before that. From everlasting. In fact, the previous verse says that he created all things. Any questions? Let's take a look at question 4 now. The ancient Egyptians and Greeks came to the conclusion that because God's thoughts are pure and the physical world is imperfect, then the physical world must be a mistake, a downgrade from what should have been a purely spiritual existence. How does Genesis 1 verses 26 through 31 differ from that conclusion? All right, so the conclusion that they came up with, they said, okay, God's mind is pure, it's perfect, everything is absolutely pure and perfect in God's mind, but here in the physical world that we live in, we can tell it's not perfect. We see so many imperfections that are happening. So obviously, they said, obviously, God's is best, and the physical world is imperfect. Well, let's take a look at Genesis 1, 26 to 31. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the 6th day. So, the ancients, they believed the physical world had to have been a mistake, because it's God's mind, God's thoughts that are perfect and pure, and the physical world is full of sickness and disease and just imperfections everywhere you look. But what does this say? How did the physical world appear? According to this. God created it. God calls it good. He doesn't just call it good. I'm sorry, I'm going to correct you on here. He calls it very good. Right? That's even better than good. He calls it very good. So he created, the physical world wasn't an accident. It was something that was in God's mind and said, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to make it. And at the end he said, oh, yes, this is very, very good. All right, any questions on number 4? Anything else? Let's move to number 5. Philosophers like Plato could point to the suffering and imperfections of our current world as proof that the physical existence was not desirable. If God insists that his creation was good and it was the work of Christ himself, see John 1 through 3, Colossians 1, 15 through 16, Hebrews 1 and 2, how do we account for the hardship associated with living on this planet? And that's Genesis 3:17 through 19. So we're going to look at these first three verses first, John, Colossians, and Hebrews, to show that the creation was part of the work that Jesus Christ did. So let's look at that first. John 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him nothing that was made was made. And then later on in that same chapter, it tells us that the Word came and inhabited among God's people, among the people here on earth. So the Word is Jesus. So here it's telling us that Jesus is the Creator. Colossians 1:15 and 16. He's the image of the invisible God. We already read this. The firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through Him and for Him. And then Hebrews 1:1 and 2. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the worlds. So we see that it was through Jesus that the creation was done. Now let's look at the question again. If God insists that His creation was good, and in fact it was Jesus that made it, how do we account for the hardships associated with living on this planet? And remember, right before the question, it told us about the philosophers. Plato, who said, hey, look, there's suffering, there's problems, there's sickness, there's disease, there's so many horrible things. That's proof that this existence is not desirable. I mean, who desires hell? Who desires sickness? Who desires pain? Who desires suffering? I don't. Do you? No. Nobody does. And that's what they said. And logically it makes sense. Logically it makes sense. But they weren't looking, thank you very much. They weren't looking at the spiritual aspect of it. That's right. And now we're going to see that. Genesis 3:17 through 19. And this tells us what actually happened. Why things are the way they are. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And there it lets us know exactly what happened. Adam and Eve followed what the serpent told them to do, which was exactly the opposite of what God had told them to do. And that is where we have all the problems that we have now. That is where we have all the sickness, all the hurt, all the pain, all the suffering. It wasn't because that was God's plan. It happened because Adam and Eve disobeyed. All right, let's go to the next question. Question number 6. In spite of the hardship we brought on ourselves, God holds out a promise to the human race. What hope do we have to look forward to? So what's this promise that we have to look forward to? Revelation 21, 1 through 5. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. That's this earth right now. This first heaven and first earth. This is the earth that has passed away. I'll keep going. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people. God Himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat at the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. So what's that hope? What's that promise? What's this new world going to be like? There's going to be no more what? No more death. No more tears. No more pain. No more suffering. Can you imagine such a place? Say that again. Excellent. A restoration of what God wanted all along at the very beginning, before Adam and Eve disobeyed and quite frankly messed it up for the rest of us. And that's the hope. That's the hope that we have. And so our ancients, they were kind of right in some things, but in some things they were not quite right. They were right that this world is awful and this world is full of suffering and pain, and who wants such a thing? But they didn't realize that there will be a time where all of this will be gone without having to worry about getting rid of the physical. It will be physical. We have a physical existence, but it will be perfect. Let's look at number 7, question 7. Quite opposite to the ancient pagans, many of today's secular thinkers insist that we have a purely material existence without a spiritual component, and that the phenomenon of human existence emerged by chance through the dance of the colliding atoms over billions of years. This perspective fails, however, to account for the emergence of consciousness, the self-awareness that allows human beings to contemplate their own existence and to wonder about the meaning of life. With Ecclesiastes 3:11 in mind, and we're about to read that, what kind of things do people contemplate that seem to indicate that we are not likely here by accident? In what ways do you think we have eternity in our hearts? So what is the things in our minds that we think about that shows that we're not here just by accident? Let's read Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. So, nowadays people talk about the existence of matter and how matter came about. But how about our thoughts? And what kind of thoughts do we think about that show it couldn't just happen like that? All right, guys, what do you think? Yes?
I think the fact that so many of us contemplate why are we here in the first place and where do we go when we're done indicates that there's, that thought alone tells me that there's something greater.
The thought alone of why are we here and what happens when we're done, how could that have evolved? That thought, who was it that said, I think, therefore I am? Come on, somebody help me out. Rene Descartes, was it? I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Descartes, maybe it was somebody else. But the thoughts that we have, why am I here? What other thoughts do we have that show that there's something else? Well, like he said, what happens when we die? Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like the sorrow for death of loved ones is such a depressing thought that if evolution was the way, it's pretty hopeless because there will be no more existence of those that we love. So the fact that we desire them to and ourselves to live beyond this world and live forever.
So the thoughts of living forever, of living more, of wanting to continue life, those are thoughts that show that there's something more. That there's this, here it says, He has put eternity in their hearts. We have a desire for eternity.
When Derek mentioned the word loved one, I just thought of the thought of love itself to me tells me something. I mean, just why would that be something within us
Exactly. Where does the idea of love come from? You know, just that thought of love. I love you. You know, they say survival of the fittest. Well, it's not survival of the fittest when I sacrifice my life for you because I love you. You know, that's me dying. That's not surviving. You know, and so, you know, that's another thing that makes us think our life has to have a meaning because we think these thoughts. Does that make sense? All right, well, we've come to the end. We've come to the end of our study guide. I want to thank you guys for coming, for being with us. And I encourage you guys, join us again tomorrow. We have part 2. It's called The Whisper of the Serpent. The Whisper of the Serpent. And I am looking forward to that. It's going to be exciting. I think it's going to be a little bit more exciting than the one that we had today. So come tomorrow. We will give you guys another study guide for tomorrow as well. If you know anyone else who might want to come, invite them for the ICTV or invite them to come tomorrow, and they can just miss one. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate having you guys here. And I always like to finish with a word of prayer. Do you mind if I have a word of prayer to finish? Let's pray. Our loving Heavenly Father, Lord, we ask you to open our eyes to see more about this Serpentine prophecy so we can learn more about you, about what you want from us. And Lord, just guide us and keep us safe. We ask you this in Jesus' name. Amen.